Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Telos as First Principle. I've noticed a common pattern underlying most contentious public debates. Once you understand it, you can see it everywhere. Today I want to describe that pattern because once you see it, it's hard to unsee. In my last video, I talked about how all knowledge is both necessary and inevitably fallible. How every framework, worldview, or field of study will always get some things wrong and leave some things out. In this video, I want to explore something that follows directly from that. Truth itself can become dangerous, not just when it's false, but when it's treated as the whole truth. A partial truth, when inflated into a total explanation, eclipses other important perspectives and truths and provides limited insight. Once a truth is totalized in that way, it begins to justify attitudes and actions that would otherwise seem extreme or even unthinkable in the context of a more complete understanding. This doesn't require lies. All it requires is taking something that is partly true and elevating it to the status of the only truth that matters. I will give several examples of this shortly. A basic premise of Life Telos' first principles is not only that life has value, but also that if we observe and understand how life works, we have a model for understanding how to contend with our problems and challenges. For instance, when we observe nature, we see that it functions as a system of values that are often contradictory. Living systems don't survive by choosing one side of a polarity and destroying the other. They work through balance, proportion, and dynamic relationship. When we lose that, truth becomes an abstraction, cut off from life itself, and eventually turns dangerous. So let's now look into how life offers a model for how to hold truth, not by picking a side, but by integrating opposites. We'll first identify a few basic polarities and later see how they play out in the social and cultural arena. One of the deepest tensions is between the individual and the collective. A single cell maintains its own membrane and chemistry, and it also depends on the wider organism's circulation and immune systems to survive. In the animal world, wolves compete for rank and mates, yet they also cooperate to hunt and rear pups. Both drives are necessary for the pack to endure, and we're no different. We prize autonomy, freedom, initiative, and privacy. We also need relationship, belonging, care, and accountability. Competition can sharpen excellence. Cooperation makes complex projects possible. In civic life, the same pattern appears as freedom and responsibility. Rights without duties erode trust, and duties without rights crush the human spirit. Healthy societies protect the person and cultivate the common good. Collapse tends to follow when either pole tries to erase the other. A second fundamental polarity is stability and change, what biology calls homeostasis and adaptation. Your body keeps temperature, pH, and blood sugar within tight ranges so you don't fall apart. Yet under stress, your hormones shift, your heart rate rises, your behavior adapts, and then the system settles back down again. Immune systems do this elegantly. They shield us, but through vaccination or gradual exposure, they also learn. Overprotection breeds fragility. Reckless exposure breeds harm. Organisms embody continuity through transformation. A crab molts, a snake sheds its skin. The creature remains itself by changing. We do this psychologically and culturally too. Traditions stabilize a community while innovation renews it. Personal growth works the same way. We revise our self-story. Parts of the old identity die so a larger self can emerge. Even skill learning alternates consolidation with deliberate pressing beyond the edge of ability. To stay alive, we have to both hold things in place and move forward. There's also the cycle of creation and destruction, growth and decay. Life builds by also breaking down. At the cellular level, anabolism constructs tissues while catabolism dismantles them. Even each breath dramatizes the pair. with oxygen fueling creation and carbon dioxide signaling spent fuel. Ecosystems regenerate through loss. Fires and grazing clear space. Dead matter feeds soil. Succession brings new growth. Brains learn by pruning, removing connections so useful pathways can strengthen. And in human life, genuine creativity requires letting go of drafts, habits, positions, and attachments that no longer serve. Grief and renewal are partners. Beneath all of this is the tension between order and chaos, signal and noise, determinacy and uncertainty. Too much order and systems stagnate. Too much chaos and they fall apart. Evolution depends on random mutation to introduce novelty and selection to keep what works. In cognition, we need stable categories to perceive it all, and it's precisely confusion or anomaly that forces a remapping and produces greater insight. Socially, shared norms and meanings enable cooperation, while dissent and experimentation prevent cultural sclerosis. Even in science, protocols and replication meet exploration and risk. Discovery needs both. The common theme here is simple. When one pole tries to eliminate its counterpart, when the individual tramples the collective or the collective smothers the person, when stability refuses to adapt or change discards continuity, when we demand growth without loss or order without uncertainty, systems become brittle and eventually fail. When the poles stay in dynamic relationship, life flourishes. And if life is our reference point, then the question is never which side must win, but what proportion in this context will keep the system alive. Again, this is not merely an abstract philosophical device or system that we can impose on life. It's derived from observations of life itself. When we step back and look at these polarities, what becomes clear is that they aren't moral preferences or mere abstract theories. They are the deep structural rhythms of life itself. Every living system, whether it's a cell, a forest, or a civilization, must find its own way to balance them. And when we forget this, we don't escape the pattern. We risk veering out of alignment with it. Let's now consider some examples of the consequences of elevating partial truths to exclusive and total explanations. Throughout history, we can see what happens. Religious traditions have offered deep moral and existential insights and provided social cohesion. But when certain interpretations have been treated as the final and total truth, we've gotten inquisitions, theocratic control, and persecution in the name of righteousness. Rationalism, especially as it developed through the Enlightenment, brought enormous gifts. It gave us the scientific method, modern medicine, technology, and the ability to understand and transform the material world in ways our ancestors could scarcely imagine. But like every great advance, it came with a shadow. By defining truth as only what can be measured, observed, or quantified, it quietly exiled much of human experience. Consciousness, inner life, meaning, value, and purpose to the margins. The outer world became real, the inner world became subjective opinion or illusory. And in that narrowing of reality, something vital was lost. The recognition that life's deepest purposes are not reducible to matter, even though they're expressed through it. Marx pointed to real dynamics of economic power and exploitation. That was a partial truth. But when that one insight was totalized, when everything was reduced to class struggle and economics, entire political systems were built on it. And when it became the only allowable truth, alternatives were suppressed, dissenters were punished, and catastrophic regimes followed. Nietzsche exposed the hypocrisy of certain moral traditions and recognized the will to power as a part of human psychology. But when fragments of his thought were stripped of context and totalized, they were later used to justify fascism and domination. Darwin helped us understand natural selection and adaptation, another partial truth. But when that lens was applied to human social worth, it mutated into eugenics and the ranking of people's value by birth. The French Revolution began with liberty, equality, and fraternity, noble truths. But when the revolutionaries believed those truths gave them license to purify society by force, the reign of terror followed. What we see in each case is not falsehood gone wild. They are partial truths, but without humility or limit, untempered by other contrasting and complementary truths. When we move from biology to culture, we can see the same polarities playing themselves out in human affairs. Only now they take the form of competing values, institutions, and ideologies. Our social and political conflicts are, in many ways, life's own tensions, writ large in human language. The problem isn't that our values are wrong, but that we totalize one side of a living polarity and moralize it as the truth and the highest priority. This same structure is alive today, even when the language changes. I want to name just a few ways that this is expressed, ways that hopefully you'll have noticed yourself. Take trauma awareness. It's true that trauma harms people and needs recognition. But if that truth becomes the whole lens through which we see individuals, we end up with fragility culture, identity built around wounding, and an avoidance of growth and resilience. On the other side, there's also the truth in the idea that human beings are capable of strength, agency, and post-traumatic growth. But when that becomes the whole story, suffering is minimized, pain is dismissed, and people are told to simply toughen up. Consider equity and merit. It's true that systems can disadvantage people and that unfairness sometimes requires correction. But if equity becomes the only lens, we get ideological coercion, denial of personal responsibility, and reverse discrimination, and the suppression of dissent. Likewise, merit and competence matter, and they're true, but when they become totalized, we see elitism, exclusion, and indifference to structural realities. Think of environmental concerns versus human progress. It's true that ecosystems need protection, but when environmentalism becomes anti-human or anti-technology, it can turn into a crusade against development, innovation, or even people themselves. Conversely, it's true that humans need energy, infrastructure, and growth to flourish. But when that becomes totalized, we justify exploitation, denial, and disregard for ecological limits. Think of the debate between public health and individual liberty. Collective health sometimes requires coordinated action, but make that the entire truth and you open the door to surveillance, coercion, and the erosion of basic freedoms. Flip it, and liberty becomes the only principle. Then we celebrate personal choice, even when it harms others or tears at social cohesion. Or consider the tension between national identity and universal compassion. It's true that communities need shared identity, cultural continuity, and boundaries to function. But totalize that, and you end up with xenophobia, exclusion, and ethno-nationalism. It's also true that every human being has value. But totalize that and you erase boundaries, deny limits to what can be given, and ignore what is required to protect and care for one's own group. One of the clearest examples of a partial truth becoming dangerous through totalization is our current debate about gender, which I spoke about in a previous video. Biological reality is undeniable. Sexed bodies, chromosomes, and reproductive roles are part of what life itself depends on. But it's also true that human beings experience gender psychologically and socially, that identity, expression, and role are not reducible to biology alone. When either of these truths tries to annihilate the other, conflict follows. A purely biological reduction ignores the depth and complexity of subjective experience. A purely self-defined, disembodied conception of identity denies our embodied nature and erodes the shared reference points that make relationship and reproduction possible. In living systems, male and female are not moral categories, but complementary strategies, expressions of the deeper polarity between agency and nurturance, protection and connection, exploration and care. When that polarity is denied, we don't transcend limitation, we lose orientation. The task is not to pick a side, but to understand how these forces belong together, biologically, psychologically, and socially, as life itself demonstrates. This isn't new. Versions of it echo through philosophy, psychology, and even ancient wisdom. But what matters is how it shows up now, in how we live and argue and build our world. One of the clearest polarities shaping our current culture wars is that of the individual and the collective. Western societies, especially those influenced by classical liberalism, have long celebrated individual freedom, autonomy, and self-determination, and with good reason. Those values fuel innovation, protect rights, and guard against tyranny. But when individualism is totalized, it erodes the shared norms and mutual obligations that make freedom sustainable. We see this in the reaction against public health measures and the rise of hyper-individual consumerism, and in the belief that personal choice should override collective responsibility at every turn. On the other hand, when the collective pole dominates, as in certain ideological movements that prioritize group identity above personal agency, individuals are reduced to representatives of categories, and moral worth is measured by conformity to that group. Both distortions claim moral superiority, yet each depends on what it denies. A culture that forgets either pole loses something essential, the individual's creative spark or the community's sustaining fabric. In all of these examples, truth becomes dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's wielded as the only thing that is right. There's another layer to all of this that I think is worth naming, because it applies to my own argument. If I've been saying that every partial truth becomes dangerous when it's totalized, then the same must be true of this one that I'm saying. The idea of integrating opposites or reconciling perspectives might sound like the final answer, but even that can be misapplied if it becomes a blanket rule. If we tried to enforce integration or balance across the board, we'd simply be totalizing another truth. Life doesn't ask for perfect symmetry in every situation. Integration isn't an abstract virtue to be imposed everywhere. It's a living discernment that depends on what the situation calls for. Sometimes one pole must lead and the other must support. Sometimes that proportion reverses, and sometimes both must operate at once, but in different degrees or through different people. Consider the question of war. One might say that defending a nation demands traditionally masculine qualities, strength, discipline, and courage. But even here, the feminine perspective has a role. Compassion for civilians, care for the wounded, reflection on when to stop fighting. If society wages war with no trace of those qualities, it loses its humanity. But if it tries to run a war purely on empathy, it won't survive long enough to express its compassion. The challenge isn't simply to integrate both sides, but to sense which qualities are needed, in what proportion, and when. That sensitivity, the ability to read what life requires, is real intelligence. We face the same challenge in nearly every human domain: parenting, leadership, therapy, education, governance. All involve polarities that must be adjusted dynamically rather than balanced statistically. To treat integration itself as a formula is to miss the living context from which all proportions arise. So even the principle I'm putting forward here of recognizing and integrating opposites is a partial truth. It's valuable only to the extent that it remains alive to context. The moment it hardens into dogma, it becomes just another ideology pretending to have the final word. Integration, like every other living process, must stay flexible, adaptive, and responsive to circumstances. And the discernment it asks for goes beyond knowing which pole belongs where. It asks how much, in what measure, and in what sequence. It's more an art than an arithmetic. We can see this confusion play out not just in individuals, but across whole societies. When balance or equality becomes an abstract moral demand rather than a living contextual discernment, it can lead to new forms of imbalance. Take the cultural pursuit of equity. At its best, equity is an attempt to correct unfair disadvantages, to help people begin to form roughly similar starting points. But when that impulse becomes universalized, detached from context and proportion, it drifts toward the fantasy that all outcomes should be identical, regardless of effort, capacity, or circumstance. What begins as compassion turns into coercion. What begins as justice hardens into control. The intention to balance becomes its own imbalance. The same thing happens in education when we confuse fairness with sameness. Children have different temperaments and abilities. Real care adapts to those differences. But when every child must perform equally in every domain, the gifted are constrained and the struggling are shamed, and no one thrives. Balance becomes bureaucracy. Even in relationships, we see this. Partners sometimes treat emotional equity, everything must be exactly 50-50, as a moral ideal. But relationships are living systems. Sometimes one gives more, sometimes the other. Over time, reciprocity matters more than symmetry. What nourishes the relationship isn't arithmetic fairness, but responsiveness to need. So whether in politics, education, or personal life, the lesson is the same. Seeking balance as a fixed formula leads to distortion just as surely as totalizing one side. Life's intelligence is contextual. It knows that fairness, equality, and harmony each have their moment, but none should rule unconditionally. And that brings us back to the central argument of this piece. Truth becomes dangerous not only when we exalt one pole of polarity, but also when we mistake any abstraction, balance, integration, or equity for a universal law divorced from life's particularities. When truth forgets its context, it stops serving life and begins to oppose it. For me, this is where Life Telos' first principle becomes especially relevant. It isn't an attempt to replace one totalizing truth with another. It doesn't claim to have the final answer, and it doesn't pretend to escape fallibility. Instead, it starts from one simple assumption: life has value. This is not restricted to biology. It also entails our cognitive and emotional functions, which are a product of brain and neurological evolution in service to the survival and flourishing of life. And as a social species, it also entails our social cohesion and collaboration. As I said earlier, it isn't only that life has value. When we study the patterns, the laws of nature, and the needs of biological, psychological, and social life, we then learn how to live as individuals and groups in ways that align with life. From there, the work is to hold truths in proportion, not in isolation or cut off from the living context they belong to. Instead of asking which truth should dominate, the question becomes, what serves life? What sustains growth, relationship, adaptation, responsibility, and flourishing? How do different truths correct and contextualize one another? It requires holding truths alongside their counterparts, not using them as weapons against our ideological opponents. The danger was never truth itself. The danger begins when we totalize a single truth and believe there is nothing left to consider or learn. The challenge is that the other partial truths that are missing from ours are the very ones that contradict what we are most committed to. We can see this dynamic clearly in the two-party political system. Each side represents one half of a living polarity: individual freedom versus collective responsibility, tradition versus progress, order versus change. In principle, democracy should integrate these values through ongoing dialogue. In practice, it often devolves into permanent combat. When one party dominates, its blind spots grow until disillusion sets in, and then we swing to the other side, only to repeat the cycle. Political campaigns depend on outrage, because outrage mobilizes votes more reliably than nuance. And so the system keeps churning, each victory sowing the seeds of its own reversal, while the underlying issues remain unresolved. It's a structural illustration of what happens when natural tensions meant for dialogue are replaced by rivalry and domination. Breaking this cycle will take more than new policies or leaders. It will take a deeper cultural maturity, the courage to tolerate cognitive dissonance, and the humility to see fragments of truth on both sides. Thanks for listening and staying until the end. If you've enjoyed this exploration, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel to get notifications for new content. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.